For those of you that weren't in our workshop yesterday morning, I'm Sumeracki. My last name used to be Smith, but when I got married, I thought, who needs that nonsense anymore? And so my name was really common. So now I have a really unique name, and my students complain about how many more letters they have to write on their course evaluations. But, so I'm really excited to be here, and I'm going to be talking to you a bit more about retrieval practice, not as general as we were talking yesterday, though some of it is going to be a little bit of a repeat because I know now we're live streaming, there's more people here, it's later in the day, so those people who said earlier they like to sleep in are maybe here. I just want to sort of start by kind of reminding you what we're doing, right? We're cognitive psychologists who are applying our work to education. And there are a lot of different types of researchers that actually do work in education, right? So there are people who are in education departments, people who are in psychology departments. There are actually groups called learning sciences, which is different from the group that Jana and I co-founded that have a sort of separate pedagogy in terms of their research. And so the cognitive framework really is about taking basic human processes like memory and attention and perception and building learning and teaching strategies on top of those. So that then when we go to test it, it does still need to be tested. We can't just assume, oh, well, we know X, Y, Z about attention, therefore this should work in theory, let's just do it. But when we go to test it, we're relatively confident that it's probably going to pan out, or at least that we're going to be able to figure out why it works or doesn't work. That's a key thing. So that then when we're talking about learning strategies or teaching strategies that work, we can say, well, it's this key piece that's really important, and some of these peripheral details don't matter as much. Okay, so it's not you have to do this intervention exactly this way, and if you change it, we don't know what will happen. It's this, well, you know what? You need this one process or these set of processes in this type of circumstance, and we can be a little bit more flexible. And the way many of us, at least, like to test whether or not learning and teaching strategies work is through what Jana and I like to call the lab to classroom model. And a lot of people use this type of model even if they maybe don't call it that. The idea is that you're starting out in the basic laboratory. And there is a common misconception, though there's truth to it, right? That really all cognitive psychologists do is sit in a lab and use really simple materials in very contrived settings and draw conclusions from those types of scenarios. And that's true. We do sit in our research labs and use very simple materials like word lists or even sometimes nonsense syllables, which you absolutely don't want your students learning in the classroom, right? Not nonsense. You want them to learn real things. But we're doing that because it allows us to draw causal conclusions, right? When we can control tons and tons of aspects of the study, it allows us to really pinpoint what's causing learning or what's hurting learning, okay? And so using that control, we can really get at these underlying why questions. But we can't just stop there. We don't want to just test things on nonsense syllables and say, well, it helped this college sophomore with this nonsense syllable list, therefore let's have the fourth graders do it in the classroom, right? Can't really do that. So we've got to ramp up. We lose a little bit of control, but we gain some applicability. So now the next level is what we like to call the applied lab setting. We're still in the lab, so still in this sort of somewhat artificial setting, though honestly, my lab is a bunch of computers, and typically certain study areas for students are a bunch of computers. We ask our students to please put their phones in their bags. Whether or not they actually do that and are paying attention is sort of, up for debate, right? So it's not completely crazy when you're thinking about a university student studying, but it's not a real classroom. But now we're using materials that lend themselves to real classroom type activities. So excerpts from textbooks or portions from textbooks along with diagrams or images. We might even use a video clip or someone lecturing. right? So real materials, we're just still controlling the setting a little bit and trying to maintain time and maintain disruption, that sort of thing. And then we can build our way up to the applied classroom setting. And here's where we're really digging in and saying, does this work in real life? We lose a fair amount of control. Anyone who's taught in K through 12, and I think I mentioned yesterday that I've been a substitute teacher before, you have, not complete control over everything that's going on in the classroom. I certainly did not as a substitute teacher. I remember once sixth graders, I watched them, they were sliding through the library in their socks, and I was just like, oh, what am I gonna do? So, there's all kinds of crazy things going on. They did tell me later it was because they were practicing for a school dance. The sixth graders were not allowed to wear their regular shoes in the gym. That's where the dance was, so they had to practice to make sure that they were, ready to go for the sixth grade dance. Anyway, so this applied classroom is where we're now using relevant materials. We're in the classroom. We're doing something different in the classroom with the teachers and the actual students on the real stuff they're trying to learn to see if it improves classroom learning in some way. Okay, so it does become a little bit more difficult to control things and to draw causal conclusions, not impossible, but a little more difficult. But taken together, a set of studies done in the lab setting, applied lab, and then in the actual classroom can be really powerful. There are pros and cons to every experimental study. There's always going to be. You can't have all of the validity. You can't have perfect internal and external and all of these things in one study. You need sets of studies, right? And this type of set can be really valuable and tell us what's going to work quite well. And of course, you don't just stop there. It's not a linear process where you have to start at basic lab, move up to classroom, and that's the end. You can move back and around in these different environments. So at any given moment, many of us will have studies going on at each of these levels. And I'm pretty sure right now I have at least one study going on at all of those levels, even just this summer, okay? One of the really cool things about this too is that by the time you get to the classroom, you already have some evidence that this thing actually works even with complex materials. It's not just a theory anymore. And the reason that's good is that you really don't want to go into the classroom and start messing around with stuff because it's actual classroom time. The students are supposed to be learning, the teachers are teaching, and so you want to be pretty confident before you start messing around with stuff. We're never absolutely confident. You need the classroom studies, but having some sort of evidence behind it is a good idea. It's also very expensive to go into classrooms, or at least it can be more so than sitting in a laboratory that's been set up already. And so, you wait until you're pretty confident, and then you can start going into the lab or the classroom, and playing around, okay? So this is the model that we like to use and sort of talk about, evidence from multiple different sources. This is the type of thing that we're talking about. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to talk about learning, and I'm going to talk about it with experiments, examples at a couple of these different levels, a basic lab and a classroom study asking that same kind of question. But first we need to talk a little bit about what we mean when we ask about learning. So I love this picture. It's one of my favorites, right? Because this is what at least many of the university students think learning is all about, just trying to funnel as much of the stuff into your head as you can, right? If I just read the book over and over again, or I read those notes, I attend lecture, or maybe I don't attend lecture, but I watch it later on, I can get it into my head, and once I get it in there, then it'll be fine when I get to test time. The problem is that we can't just worry about getting it in. We also have to worry about getting it back out, right? What good is it if it's in our heads, but in a specific scenario where we're supposed to be remembering something, we can't remember it? Sort of that everyone's had that tip of the tongue moment where you know something, but you just can't bring it to mind, and usually we can figure it out eventually. But maybe you don't realize that you know it, right? And this happens with university students at least all the time, right? You give them a question and they're like, I know the answer, but I don't know the answer. And then later on, they can look it up and figure it out. But what good is it if you can't get it back out? right? So we need to worry about getting it in. We also need to worry about getting it back out. And that's the process of retrieval, bringing that information to mind and producing it, typically producing it in some way to demonstrate that you've actually retrieved the thing, okay? We know this as instructors, and so we give our students tests, typically for assessment purposes, right? We measure learning in a test scenario or quizzing scenarios. But what is really cool about these testing scenarios is that in addition to measuring learning, they also produce learning. This probably isn't new to the people in this room and the people who are watching. We've been talking about this throughout the conference. So retrieval practice can help learning in a few different ways, right? There are some effects that are indirect, meaning that the retrieval helps something, and then that something helps learning, right? So retrieval practice can give you feedback on what you know and what you don't know. It can also allow you to allocate your study time more appropriately, or maybe you're making decisions about whether or not you need to go to class or whatever. It can help you do that. It can also be quite motivating. So if you're preparing for a test or quiz and you take a practice test or quiz and you don't do as well as you wanted to, maybe then instead of going to do something else, going out with friends or playing outside or, playing video games, you're going to keep studying to try to increase your performance on those practice tests or quizzes. At least that would be the hope, right? And it can also be motivating when you take a few practice tests and you keep getting better. Even if it's a slow process, it's exciting to see that you're doing better. It's sort of seeing your own learning in a really meaningful way. Okay, so these are indirect effects, and those of you that were in the room yesterday, you're getting some spaced practice on the benefits of retrieval. Okay, there's also this direct effect, right, which is the coolest thing. Just bringing information to mind produces learning, even in the absence of all of this other stuff. So feedback is good. One of the best ways, sort of the best scenarios to practice retrieval is to try to produce it and then give yourself feedback or restudy. But you don't have to have it. When you retrieve information from a test, you're learning. Adding the feedback is just piling on more learning. And the motivation, that's just piling on more learning. And there are actually effects called test potentiated learning effects, where after you try to retrieve, then when you restudy the information, you're learning more from that restudy opportunity than you would have if you hadn't practiced retrieval before. So it sort of makes your next move more efficient. And all of these things just pile on, okay? Making this one of the most useful learning tools that you can use once you kind of have it in your head already. You need some other strategies in order to develop understanding. You need spaced practice, but retrieval practice really is kind of the golden goose. Combining it with spaced practice is quite valuable. Okay, so I'm going to ask and answer 2 research questions, one from the basic lab and one from the classroom level of that lab to classroom model. So the first one is kind of just asking, does retrieval practice produce more learning than just restudying? It's not. It's a study that you guys haven't seen before, even if you were in, or at least I shouldn't say that. It's a study you didn't see yesterday. I don't know if you've never seen it before. A study you didn't see yesterday. It has an extra little twist to it. And then at the applied classroom level, I'm going to ask, does providing questions throughout a lecture, oops, that says applied classroom, it shouldn't. Does providing questions throughout the lecture and having students bring information to mind and then just thinking about it or writing it down, does that help? Okay. So first experiment. This is basic lab stuff, so we're using really basic materials, stuff that probably isn't being taught in the real classroom, unless maybe we're in kindergarten and we're learning about categories, which is fine, but this study was done with college students. So in the first phase, the students are studying categories and then items within those categories. So they might see like vegetables, cucumber, trees, birch, sports, hockey, and on and on and on. And they're actually getting a number of items within each of those categories. So they might also see vegetable, zucchini. and on. They're not getting the most common items from the category because we don't want people to just guess. So the first thing that comes to mind when I say vegetables might be carrot. This is all based on norms, right? And so that's not going to be on this list. So they're not just guessing. They're still common category items, but not the most common. So they study those. And then during phase 2, they restudy some of the items. So they're seeing them again. And then for some of the items, they're actually asked to retrieve. They're given the category, and they're given the first 2 items, or the first 2 letters of the item, and they're asked to try to retrieve it, which means bring it to mind. So everyone is restudying some and practicing retrieval on others. But as a between subjects manipulation, some of the students are instructed to actually type out the word. So if they see vegetable and then CU, they're supposed to type cucumber. So they're overtly producing the information. Some of the students are not supposed to take that step. They're told, just think of the answer. So they're retrieving it. They're just not overtly producing it. And so this is what we might call covert retrieval. In the literature, if you search, you'll mostly find overt retrieval because you have to know whether or not the student retrieved the thing to really be able to analyze the data, right? So it's not common just to say, think about it, and then move along because we want to know, did you think about it? Did you answer it correctly? Didn't you? You know, what might that look like? But in this experiment, I wanted to know if bringing the information to mind was sufficient or if this production added something to the process. And this will become a little bit more clear, the application value, in a little bit. So then after a couple of days, they did a final assessment where they just wrote down as many of the items as they could. Now, one thing I want to point out too is that in this experiment, there is no restudy opportunity. They're not getting feedback on whether or not they're right or wrong. So this is the direct effects of learning, okay? That also means that we are comparing 100% re-exposure to those items in the restudy condition to whatever they can retrieve in the retrieval condition, which is not 100%. For the overt condition, it's about 70%. We don't know what it is in the covert condition, but we would assume it would be around that level. And in some other experiments in the series, I asked the students, well, did you get it or not? And they typically say yes at the same rate at the other students are able to produce it. So it's probably about the same. And here's what you find, okay? So retrieval practice is better than restudy. Blue bars are bigger than yellow bars, right? But then when you compare overt and covert retrieval, you find that there's actually not a big difference between them. And in this particular experiment, there's a tiny little bump of covert retrieval being a little bit better. It's the process of bringing it to mind that's valuable. It's not about the production, at least not in this scenario, okay? So bringing it to mind is good. That process of writing it, typing it, saying out loud, that can be useful for us to sort of check, but you don't have to do that, at least if you can motivate the students to actually bring it to mind, right? Because I could ask you guys a question now and say, think of the answer, and I have no idea what you're thinking about. You might be thinking about something completely different. You might maybe think you've thought of the answer, but maybe you haven't, or maybe you're wrong, right? So if you can motivate students to retrieve, that's good, but we don't really know if that's always happening. Okay, and I actually took a look at a couple of experiments across a couple of different papers. So Adam Putnam was an author on a paper that was looking at something similar. He was actually my office mate in graduate school when we were doing this work, and we sort of had our ideas sort of blended somehow a little bit during a lab meeting, and we ended up with 2 papers that were really similar sort of on accident. So in any case, we looked across a number of experiments and said, well, what is the effect size of retrieval compared to this control? When we bring information to mind compared to just restudying, what does that look like? And you can see across a number of studies, the effect size is pretty big. All of them find effects of retrieval practice. And when you do sort of a mini meta-analysis, you look at the effect size D, which just tells you, sort of what's the difference between these two conditions on average. You can see that the effect size is bigger than 1, and when you combine all of these data, you actually get a pretty tight confidence interval around that effect size. We know that it's relatively large. When you have smaller sample sizes, you might have a big effect size, but the confidence interval around that effect size might be from 0.05 all the way to, 1.95 or something. One of my advisors at Purdue used to say anywhere from who cares to call the Pentagon. That's often what you get when you're looking at 95% confidence intervals in one study. But when you combine, you can start measuring more precisely. And now we can say, yeah, look, this effect size D is pretty big and we're pretty confident. What happens when we look across all of these studies comparing covert retrieval and overt retrieval? Remember the study I showed you had a little bit of a bump for covert being a little bit better? Oh, sorry, so the actual value is 1.1. What happens when you look at covert versus overt? 0.0027, which is basically 0. Okay, so across a number of studies, it doesn't matter. And it makes sense that it doesn't matter, right? Because who cares if you're writing it or typing it? The process is bringing the information to mind. If you engage in that process, it's going to be good. This is one of the reasons why we can say with relative confidence that if you're creating concept maps from memory or drawing from memory, that all should be pretty good because you're bringing the information to mind. Some types of retrieval activities might lend themselves to bringing certain types of things to mind. So concept mapping from memory might help you sort of understand relationships between ideas, retrieve how these types of things are related or maybe how they're different. But it's that bringing information to mind that's good. Okay? But does this work in the classroom? And what would be the sort of applied value of this in the classroom, right? Well, I think the applied value is how many of you have ever asked a question in class, waited a second, and then called on one student to answer? Who's done that? Raise your hand. Most of us have. Some of you might say, well, why don't you all write it down and then you call on a specific student, but that often takes longer and we don't really know if they're writing it down unless you're collecting it. So in some senses, they might just be doing covert retrieval anyway. Oftentimes I will say to my students, well, why don't you think about it and write it down? And some of them will say, I've got it in my head. I'm like, all right, sure, that's fine, okay? So the next question is, does providing questions throughout the lecture and having them bring the information to mind help, or do we actually need them to write it down? Okay. So in what turned into kind of a large experiment, we had students in a live classroom do this. And the reason we did that is we wanted to make sure that the students were quite motivated to actually retrieve the information covertly. And having them in the classroom where they're actually trying to learn the material for a specific reason, whether that's their grade, getting credit in the class, whether they just really like the topic, whatever it is, that might be a little bit more motivating than then just bringing them in and saying, please try really hard to answer the questions, okay? Because complex materials are going to be more difficult to bring to mind, okay? And so in this experiment, we actually had now 5 different sections of students in an upper level research methods course that I was teaching and that Jana was teaching at Rhode Island College and University of Massachusetts Lowell. And the counterbalancing was handled across different sections. So there's not really true random assignment, but it's a within subjects design. We're randomly assigning the sections to different counterbalancing conditions. And it turns out that my students and Jana's students are pretty similar in terms of their performance on these lectures, okay? So what they did is they engaged in 3 different learning conditions. They either just viewed a lecture with no retrieval practice, so there were no questions. They were allowed to ask questions, but I didn't ask them specific questions. They were allowed to take notes just like normal. This was information they needed to know eventually, but it was just a normal lecture, somewhat passive, although my students do tend to ask questions themselves. In the overt and covert retrieval conditions, I actually asked questions. I'm going to show you what this looks like, okay? We motivated students to retrieve either overtly or covertly by doing cold calling. Has anyone ever done that in their class before? They don't really like it so much, but in the research methods class, I do actually tell them the purpose of the class is to learn how to ask research questions, collect data, and analyze it. It's after they've already taken basic research methods and statistics. They're supposed to be putting it all together. So I actually give them their data, de-identified of course, and they run analyses and write it up. So they want the experiment to go well, and if I explain like the cold calling's really important, and you know, if you don't get it right, it's okay. We will figure it out. We'll talk about the material. This isn't your one and only opportunity to learn this stuff. Just like normal classes shouldn't be your one and only opportunity. You have time to study and work on it later. That helps a little bit. They still don't like the cold calling, but it is what it is. So what I did is in a typical lecture, I just lectured on a given topic. Okay, just normal me standing there, slides. I don't normally wear a suit, but that's what I'm wearing in this picture. In the overt retrieval condition, I would give my normal lecture, and then I'd stop and give them a question, and I tell them they had little booklets, and I said, turn to the next page and write the answer to this question. Okay, and I gave them some time, waited until they were done writing mostly. They kind of looked up at me, gave me the go-ahead, and then I would randomly pick a student to answer out loud. I just had an app on my phone. Sometimes if I forgot my phone, I'd pull on like names out of a hat or something. So randomly select a student, ask them what the answer is. They then say it out loud, and I, wearing my researcher hat, mark down the name of that student because now they're not really in the overt just write it down condition anymore. They've had to actually say it out loud. So the students that are answering the questions out loud, for that item, that data is removed because that's not the same condition anymore. And there's not enough power to look at that specific condition. It's just one item for one student per item. So, but they are randomly selected, and so the rest of the students hear that answer, and then I either say yes, exactly, or I say well, close, and give them a little bit of feedback. So everyone is getting feedback in this experiment, which is what would happen in a normal lecture setting. Okay. Then covert retrieval was very similar, but they were simply asked to think about it. And they sat there and they thought about it, and then they kind of gave me the nod, and I randomly selected a student. I will say that the covert retrieval condition takes much less time. There's less time involved to just think about the answer than to actually have to write it all out on paper. So there is a timing thing going on here. But that's what you would do in a normal class. You might give them a couple seconds, and then you call on a student, and that student answers. And again, I'm marking the student's name and pulling that item out of the analysis because that student is no longer in the covert condition anymore. They're in the I just got called to answer in front of the class condition, right? Okay, so what does this look like 2 days later? So 2 days later, they come in and they answer a bunch of short answer questions. And what we're interested in is how well they do, and does producing the information on paper help in any way above and beyond? As an instructor, do you need to stop and ask the students to write out the answer every time? Well, the answer is no. The process is important. It doesn't so much matter if you're producing it. When the students bring it to mind, it helps them just as much as when they have to write it out, even though we're taking a little bit less time, and even though they might feel slightly less accountable. And I think the reason here is because of that cold calling procedure. They don't know if their name is going to be picked, so they actually have to think about it. This probably would be different if I was just calling on the student that raised their hand, because most students could then think, well, I don't have to raise my hand, so I'm not going to have to answer, and I don't have to think of the answer. So if cold calling isn't an option, and I will say it did not make me very popular, if cold calling is not an option, perhaps you should have the students write it down. We also have a couple other experiments that aren't quite ready for presentation. We need to do some more work, but there's a hint of an effect where possibly having the students bring the answer to mind with complex materials inflates confidence a little bit. Not quite sure if that's going to stay that way or if it's going to pan out that way, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. And if all you have to do is bring it to mind, you can sort of do the, oh, I've got a fuzzy idea of what that answer might be. I think I know it. You might say, yeah, sure. Whereas when you have to actually write it down, you're like, actually, I don't know what the answer is, or I can't articulate it. So there could be other things going on. But this experiment shows us it's really the process. And it's not about simple materials versus complex materials. You know, covert retrieval doesn't work in this particular scenario. The process is the same. The process is what's important. Producing it is much less so important in this scenario, okay? Bringing information to mind is good. And so when we're talking to teachers, we can say, look, we know the process is what's important, and we can tinker with things and switch things around for any sort of intervention that you're doing in the classroom to just make sure that the students are doing some retrieval-based learning activity so that they're bringing the information to mind, because we know that's the process that's really important. We're not set to just, it has to be exactly this way, and we don't know if you change something, what might happen. So this is why we talk about these flexible guiding principles. We know the why underneath, okay? So does providing these questions throughout the lecture improve learning, and can they just bring it to mind? Well, yes, if they're motivated to actually produce the answer. And I have seen a study that was published with just sort of basic terms and definitions from psychology where they were having the students just bring the information to mind, and that one didn't seem to produce as much learning. It's probably about the motivation in that experimental setting, not about covert retrieval itself. Okay? So that's just one strategy among many that can be quite effective. Okay, so retrieval practice isn't the only strategy that we look at, although it's the one that I look at the most because it's the one that sort of fuels my lab and the one I get the most excited about. But there are a handful of strategies that cognitive psychologists have deemed to be particularly effective based on decades, sometimes even centuries of research. So actually, retrieval practice is more than 100 years old. The first paper that I'm aware of, so maybe there's something older. If you find something, let me know. The first one I'm aware of was from 1909. So over 100 years ago. This is not a new thing. And even in the late 80s, Glover published an article that said the testing phenomena, not gone but nearly forgotten, as basically saying, come on guys, don't forget about this. And that was in the late 80s. So this isn't new. It's just been sort of reinvigorated, I think, within the last, say, maybe 10 to 12 years. Spacing is the same way. This was talked about in Ebbinghaus's early chapters. I think those were published in oh boy, I shouldn't have tried to say the date, 1889 maybe, somewhere in there, in the late 1800s. Okay. The other 4 strategies are on the newer side. And throughout the conference, we've heard about, I think, almost all of them. Certainly interleaving, spacing, retrieval, and dual coding. Okay. So based on a lot of cognitive research that's at that basic level and in the applied classroom and in that real live classroom setting, we can say that these tend to work in many situations, and we can flexibly use them. But a lot of us tend, at least as far as researchers go, a lot of us tend to publish our work in peer-reviewed journals. And as much as we need to publish in peer-reviewed journals, and that peer review process is really important, it's not the best way, at least in my opinion, to get that information out to all of the people who might be interested in it, who need it, who want it. Okay? And so for that reason, in part, Jana and I were trying to come up with new, fun ways to get that information out there. And we ended up, Jana was on Twitter one evening, tweeting at students, answering what they probably thought was a hypothetical question. How am I ever going to learn all of this? Jana was like, I can tell you how, and started tweeting at them. And I noticed, because I was trying to create an assignment for my cognitive psychology class, a Twitter assignment where they were supposed to find articles about cognitive psychology and sort of write a little tweet about how it was interesting, something we were learning in class and how it applied to real life. The assignment really was a disaster, and I'm never doing it again. But because of that, I was on Twitter trying to sort of develop my professional Twitter account and saw what Jana was doing and decided to jump on board. And we ended up creating an account to use together, Ace That Test. At that time, it was really just because we were tweeting at students and wanted them to pay attention, and we thought Ace That Test would help. It wasn't an overly well thought out Twitter handle, but it is what it is. And we've learned that the learning scientists, or even just learning scientists, is too long, so we've kept Ace That Test, even though it kind of implies that we're just trying to help them get through a test, which isn't really true. We want to help students learn and kind of produce durable learning in the long run. But through that project, which has now grown a lot, we have a lot of materials now that are available online to teachers, to students, to parents, that are designed to be not as lengthy and jargony and dense as journal articles. And the goal really is to talk about science and talk with teachers and learn from teachers and have researchers and everyone sort of communicating in both directions, and we've been trying to do that. So in addition to Jana and myself, we also have 3 members on the team. Dr. Cindy Niebel is at Washburn University. She's in the lower left. Carolina Cooper-Tetzel is in Scotland, although she actually did much of her formal schooling in Germany, and she was in both the US and Canada at some point, so we have an international thing going. And then our newest recruit is Dr. Althea Kaminsky. She's getting married, so Bauernschmidt, now she'll be Kaminsky, so she's losing letters, whereas I gained them. This team that we put together, the goal really is to try to talk about science with people who would want to hear about it, not just other researchers, although that's really important, and peer-reviewed journal articles are still quite important. But having discussions, kind of like the types of things we're doing at this conference, but all the time. So we have a lot of resources. I won't go over all of them in a long form, but we have blogs and posters, translations, PowerPoints, videos, and a podcast, all designed to sort of help get the information out there. You can listen to the podcasts on your commute, and you can read the blogs when they come out during the week. Just sort of digestible little bite-sized pieces of the science of learning. And then we also have a book coming out next month that we're quite excited about, that talks about these 6 strategies, applies it to for teachers, for students, and for parents, and has a lot of the amazing visualizations that Oliver Caviglioli does, which I think are just he's really good at taking an entire experimental design and the results and putting it into one image that gives you the full picture. So working with him has been really fantastic. And all of this was made possible by different grants, so we have to thank Rhode Island College and University of Massachusetts Lowell, but we've been sort of piecing together funding to produce all of these different resources online and to help with our research. And then I also want to thank the Learning Scientists team, as well as a number of undergraduate students who have been working on these projects in my lab, some of whom are actually McNair scholars. And I don't know if you have McNair in Canada. Does that sound familiar? It's a organization, it's a program really, grant-funded program that brings students who are interested in getting a PhD or a doctoral degree of some sort, though I do think it has to be PhD. I don't think MD or PharmD, that sort of thing, count. They're first-generation college students, often from lower socioeconomic status, often from their parents are often immigrants. Many of their parents don't speak English. minority students, but primarily first generation, who are getting research experience and traveling to conferences and presenting. They're designing experiments and contributing to projects and papers. And so I just sort of want to highlight that, because I think that's one of the most fun things that I do in my research lab, is working with those students and sort of getting them ready to go off and do their PhDs, and they're contributing to this research. And thank you to you for listening to me. I should have time.
Questions?
Yeah, I have time, right?
Thank you very much, Megan. We have time to take some questions from the audience.
So I'm going to be that guy with a two-part question.
Okay, that's fine.
The first question is, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the criterial task in your applied study. So you mentioned it was like kind of like a short answer format, I think. I was just wondering, like, what kind of questions were they being asked?
They're actually quite similar to the ones that we asked them during the lecture. They're not just like, tell me the definition of X. It's usually like, the two topics that we're teaching them are small n designs and quasi-experimental designs. And the reason for that is that by the time the students get to an upper level research methods course, they're pretty familiar with independent variables and dependent variables. But small n and quasi designs are ones that they don't hear about as much. They may be learned a little bit, but they're more new. So for example, I might say, well, if in a quasi-experimental design, if you were to match individuals in the experiment on some variable, what would be the problem with that and why? And the whole idea is you're going to have regression to the mean, and there's these shifts, and so they'd have to answer questions along those lines. So applied questions that are important in the research methods context, things that I would ask them on a final exam, for example, but not, they're not just, tell me about one topic. It's not free recall. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the reason I asked that is because I think it was Tamara Van Gogh that posted, or she published a paper, I think it was 2016, kind of talking about material complexity in relation to retrieval practice. And I guess I'm just wondering, I don't know, in my head it kind of seems like with overt and covert, I'm just kind of speculating here, but I'm wondering if overt retrieval practice might actually be better when it's like a multi-stage process they have to go through, where it's not that they can just bring everything to mind at once. They have to do the first part, output something, and then from there work to the next step, and so on.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that with some students, the writing it down is going to be really important. Some students may be better at sort of walking through those steps in their head compared to the student that might want to write it down. My thought is that when you have a big multi-part question in a lecture, you're probably not just going to ask the question and then wait a couple seconds and then call on one person to answer the entire question. More than likely in that scenario, you would want the students to produce the response in some way, either describing it and explaining it to a peer or sort of writing it out on paper and then talk about it. The question here was really kind of those quicker questions. If I say, what's the problem with this? And then I wait a second, and then I call on a student. Is it just that one student who benefits, or does everyone benefit if they brought the information to mind? Initially, when I was doing the work with simple materials, I cared more about the process than I did the applied value, at least in that particular situation. But then there was a study that was done that said, oh, look, it doesn't work with complex materials. And I thought, well, that can't be, because the process should be the same. It shouldn't be about this, it works in this scenario, but the boundary condition is this. And so that's why I wanted to do this work. But yeah, if you have a really big complex thing, it's going to be easier to follow your own process and structure if you write it out. Although if you're thinking about it and you keep thinking and it causes you to kind of keep going back over some pieces, you might actually engage in repeated retrieval, which could be beneficial. So I can't say for sure, but that's my intuition based on the studies that we have done.
Yeah, the individual differences component is interesting because some people might be able to go through the steps without any hassle, where some students might kind of...
Right, well, it's just like some students are better at the mental rotation task than others. Some students are better at visualizing and sort of, moving through space that they're not actually in. Some students are better at imagery than others. Some students are probably better at doing this sort of narrative in their head. Yeah, thanks. Yes?
I'm curious about your research design and more specifically with respect to access to data. At the University of Guelph, researchers in education have been told that any kind of assessment outcome is proprietary and belongs to the university, such that even with informed consent, you're still not allowed to use it for research purposes. I'm wondering if you've encountered that and or have heard or anybody else how to get around those types of things?
I've never heard that, and I'm not an expert in this particular, but I was under the impression that when you used an assessment that was already going to happen in the classroom, that the rules were actually less strict.
Yeah.
But you know, I will say what I did have a hard time getting through my IRB, but Rhode Island College is a small place and we don't have a medical school, and so you know, there are the stereotypes that go along with that in terms of, you know, difficulty getting things through. What I ended up having to do is at the very beginning, I explained to them, you're going to be doing this study, and they know that Research Methods 3 involves taking a study from beginning to end. But the difference is with experimental, it would be very hard to have them all design an experiment and run it when I have 30 students in the class and we don't really have the lab space for that. The students can create their own surveys in some of the other types of research methods. But so I actually have them participate in the experiment themselves, and then I give them their data, and it actually helps them write the paper. And so I explain this to them, and then a different instructor who is city trained and identified at the outset comes in, does the informed consent, seals the consent forms in an envelope, and that envelope stays in her office until I've submitted my grades, and then I access them. So I go throughout the semester running the experiment for them for the assignment. I de-identify their data, I give the data to them. None of that is actually graded though, so the assessment is just for the purpose of the experiment, but they're motivated because A, they will have an assessment later on it that is for their grade, and B, it's their data. It's what they have to work with for the rest of the term. So they work with it. It's all, I have the key to which students go to which subject ID numbers. And then after their grades are submitted, I get the magic envelope with the consent forms. I match consent to students, delete the data to which I do not have consent, which is painful because I've already collected it and I've already kind of looked at it. I've had to work with the students, but I delete it and then de-identify, destroy the key, and that's how that goes. It was sort of painful, and I think this project now has to go on forever because I'm afraid if I ever close this IRB that they'll never let me do it again. And so I just every semester have to come up with something. But that's how I do it, and it's been okay. It doesn't, how well they do on that assessment does not count for their grade, but they're still more motivated than if you had a student coming into the lab and just doing a random experiment, I'd say. Does that sort of answer your question? I mean, I don't know about, that sounds very odd.
It was a bit of a shock.
Yeah, wow, okay, yeah.
I just had a clarification question first, because I forgot. In your control condition as well, not the covert or overt, they're getting cold called on those days as well?
Mm-mm. No, it's just a normal lecture.
Okay, so do you think that even regardless of covert or overt retrieval, that just it's, I was going to say threat,
The threat of cold calling?
The threat of being cold called is actually a big part of what's making them do better. They might even prepare ahead of time more.
One, they are not preparing ahead of time. And I know that because they don't know what the topic's going to be. And also they're not preparing ahead of time. So that's one. Two, you're right, it could be some of that sort of cold calling scenario that's making it better than the control condition. I care less about whether or not retrieval practice improves learning compared to a control for that experiment because that's been established for quite some time. It's in there to make sure the experiment's actually sensitive enough to detect something. So I can't just run overt and covert and then say, oh, look, they're the same, therefore they're the same. I could do that really easily, right? Because then you just design an experiment that's not sensitive enough to find any differences, and there you go. So I know that I'm seeing a difference. What exactly the reason for it is slightly less important in that scenario because the argument isn't, oh, look, now we can say retrieval practice helps. It's the comparison between the two. But you're right, it could be some sort of cold calling, although I will say they are very attentive anytime we're running the experiment because while they're not being graded on their answers, they are going to have to write the paper. And so they are more anxious when they first come in on those days because they're like, I gotta write everything down. And I'm like, just experience it and then we'll talk about it and write it. But they're very like, more so than normal, kind of going slide by slide and being like, and making sure they're paying attention because they know they have to write the big paper and they're scared of the big paper.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of it partially in terms of evidence for why a cold calling strategy is a good one.
Yeah.
It is, as you say, quite unpopular, but intuitively I agree with you. I think it's quite a good strategy.
Yeah, and I guess you'd have to find a way to test it where, maybe this is the next thing I do, where you're cold calling before they know the question or something so that you don't have covert or overt retrieval going on, but you still have some sort of cold calling on questions, and then you could remove those from the items. I think you might still end up with some remnants of retrieval in that scenario, but yeah, that could be, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah. No, I wonder that, yeah, you just have days you go, okay, this day is going to be a day where cold calling happens. You say that at the beginning of the class. Versus say, okay, today you're all safe at the beginning of the class, whether they have some kind of performance difference.
Corey, do you have a follow-up question? I'm cold calling you.
Oh, I was like, what? Yeah?
Works.
What about anticipation anxiety? So just like knowing that you might be called upon to answer a question, does that affect your memory after the fact? Because now you no longer have to pay attention because you're not going to be.
Oh no, they put their name back in.
Can you repeat the question, please?
She's basically asking anticipation of being called might have something to do with it, and were you getting at once the student is cold called once, do they sort of stop paying attention?
Or is their name put back?
I put their name back in, but I don't actually ever call on them again because I don't want to have the data be too unbalanced, but they don't know that. And actually, to trick them, the first time I did it, there was a student who was absent, and so I called on the absent student, and that was that was natural, of course, right? The absent student came out of the app first. And then a couple times later, I was like, oh, I'll just call on the absent student again so that they are like, oh, she's back in the pool. Which was like a lie. But yeah, if I get a student a second time, I just hit the button again so that, because I don't want to pull too many data points away from that student. I don't know what it would do, but they think that they could be called again. But you're right, there could be something just to being like, she might call on me. I mean, maybe cold calling is just the solution to many of our problems. I don't know.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. I'll answer your question after, I promise.
I was just wondering, for when you tested everyone to write a short answer question, if the cohort learners took longer to produce it because they haven't written it down.
Oh, you know what? There's no way with these data, there's no way for me to tell because it's a within subjects design. So when they're answering all of these questions, the overt and the covert ones are all mixed up and it's a paper test. So I don't know if they take longer to answer. I guess I could try to do it in the computer lab and take response times, but I don't know if they took longer, but performance is the same, and there's even a little hint now, again, where covert retrieval looks a little bit better than overt. I don't believe I think that's probably just error, but it does lend some extra confidence to look, really, this thing isn't inferior. But I don't know, that's a good question. They definitely take less time when they're answering it initially. So it takes longer to have them write it out than to just sort of wait, and then I'm like, are you guys ready? And they're like, I'm ready. Okay. Am I allowed? Okay.
Two more questions.
Just with respect to the cold calling, have you ever had any accommodation issues with that?
I did have one student who indicated that they did not want to be called out. Well, it showed up on the accommodation form at the beginning of the semester, and I always talk with them, and one of the things was not to be called out. And so I did talk to that student, but then what they told me was, just don't call me to read a paragraph. It was, I guess, reading. I was like, well, what if I called on you to answer a question? And that student said, no, that's no big deal. But in and I was like, oh, okay. So sure. And then, but I did check before the experiment to make sure. But honestly, what I probably would have done in that scenario is just taken the name out of the app, but no one would need to know that because there's 30 students and there's only a handful of questions. So not everyone gets called every time. That student would then know that they weren't going to be called on, but presumably that student, if they were going to be called, it would produce some sort of worse scenario.
Do you give them a warning at the beginning of the class? Because I mean, I don't know.
They know what's going to happen in the experiment. Yeah, they know we're going to do that. That's part of, I think, I have to tell them what they're going to do so that they can choose not to come to class if they don't want to participate. Although arguably, I mean, I've argued with the IRB about this because, like, really they can always choose not to come to class or not participate. Like, I can't force them to engage in class, but as long as they're not being disruptive, it's not a problem. But they know, and that's never been a problem, especially because I'm not grading the answers to the cold call questions, and they know that. So.
Unless there's another question from, say, Farga. We'll give the final question and we're on again. Really?
Yeah, actually, follow up on what she asked.
Okay. See? There you go. Okay.
So I think part of the question in terms of anticipating answers, the question I think that she was trying to get at is what happens to other information being taught in the lecture that was not directly asked?
Oh.
So does that asking the question get people's attention focused on that one in a way to the detriment of the other related information, or is there maybe possibly some potentiating effect?
I don't know. That's a very good question. They don't. I'm teaching along, and then surprise! Now there's a question. Let's answer it. I don't know. I don't know. You stumped me. Let's end on that. Thank you.
Thank you.